Why the avoidant can't handle the super empath's ice, cold detachment. You know what's funny? The person who once made you feel like you were too much suddenly can't handle it when you stop trying. The moment the empath goes quiet, the avoidant starts to panic. Because nothing feels colder than the silence of someone who used to understand you better than you understood yourself. Let's talk about why that happens. Why the avoidant, the person who needed space, suddenly can't handle it when you finally give it to them. See, the super empath has a gift, an ability to feel deeply, to read the emotional temperature of a room before anyone else even notices the shift. And in relationships, that empathy becomes their love language. They over-deliver emotionally. They reach out, they explain, they soothe, they fix. But here's where it gets interesting. When that same empath finally learns detachment, not out of spite, but out of self-respect, it changes the entire power dynamic. The avoidant, who's used to being the one pulling away, suddenly finds the tables turned, because now they're the one feeling unseen, unheard, and uncertain. And that's the one emotion the avoidant can't control: uncertainty. The super empath's ice, cold detachment isn't cruelty. It's clarity. It's the moment they stop trying to be understood by someone who was never listening. And ironically, that's when the avoidant realizes just how powerful the empath's presence really was. It's not that the empath became heartless, they just stopped volunteering to be hurt. Empathy is often misunderstood. People see it as softness, as something that makes you too sensitive, too emotional, too easily affected. But the truth is, empathy is one of the most powerful emotional skills a person can have. It's the ability to feel deeply, to connect beyond words, to notice the subtle cues that others miss. The super empath isn't just someone who feels a lot. They sense patterns, they pick up on tone, silence, body language, and they can interpret emotional energy with precision. That awareness can be magnetic. It draws people in. It makes others feel seen, understood, and safe. But that same gift can turn into a trap when it's not balanced with boundaries. The empath often ends up overextending themselves, trying to meet emotional needs that were never theirs to carry. They notice when someone is withdrawing, and instead of stepping back, they lean in. They interpret distance as a signal to try harder, to understand more, to love deeper. They end up becoming the emotional anchor in a relationship that's drifting. This is where empathy begins to morph from power into exhaustion. Because when your focus is always on someone else's emotional landscape, you lose track of your own. You stop asking, "What do I need?" and start asking, "What can I do to make them feel better?" It sounds loving, and it is, but it's also the beginning of emotional self-erasure. The avoidant, who often struggles with intimacy and vulnerability, unknowingly benefits from this imbalance. The more the empath gives, the more the avoidant pulls away, and a silent dance begins. What the empath doesn't realize at first is that their overfunctioning actually feeds the avoidant's distance. By constantly reaching out, they confirm the avoidant's belief that love will always chase, that they can withhold emotion and still be cared for. It creates a cycle where empathy becomes overexposure, giving access to someone who hasn't earned that level of emotional safety. The empath believes their love can soften the avoidant's fear, but love without boundaries doesn't inspire safety, it invites complacency. The turning point comes when the empath begins to reclaim their power. When they recognize that empathy doesn't mean absorbing someone else's pain, but understanding it without losing themselves in it. That shift is subtle but seismic. Instead of reacting to emotional withdrawal with anxiety, they respond with awareness. Instead of explaining themselves over and over, they choose silence. And for the first time, the avoidant feels the absence of that energy, the warmth, the attention, the understanding that was always there. That's when empathy transforms back into power. It's not about closing off emotionally, but about channeling that sensitivity inward. The empath begins to listen to their own discomfort instead of minimizing it. They stop making excuses for someone else's inconsistency. They stop translating mixed signals into hope. Their empathy becomes selective, intentional, grounded, self-respecting. Real empathy, the kind that's mature and centered, doesn't chase validation. It knows its worth. It can care deeply without collapsing into someone else's chaos. And once the super empath reaches that level of emotional mastery, their calm detachment feels almost supernatural. It's not ice, it's equilibrium. It's the quiet strength of someone who finally understands that the most powerful form of empathy begins with themselves. The avoidant personality often operates from a place of hidden fear, fear of being consumed, controlled, or emotionally trapped. On the surface, they appear calm, composed, and in control, but beneath that exterior lies a constant tension between wanting connection and resisting it. The avoidant is drawn to closeness, yet the moment it starts to feel too real, too vulnerable, they instinctively pull away. It's not because they don't care, it's because intimacy feels like surrender, and surrender feels unsafe. This is where the dynamic with the super empath becomes so charged. The empath feels that distance immediately and takes it personally. They sense the retreat and respond with pursuit, trying to restore the connection. The avoidant becomes accustomed to that rhythm. They withdraw, and the empath moves closer. They maintain a sense of emotional power by keeping the empath in a constant state of uncertainty. It's not a conscious manipulation. Most of the time, it's a deeply ingrained defense mechanism. The avoidant feels safest when they are the ones setting the pace of the emotional exchange. They thrive on being needed, but not fully available. The empath, motivated by care and understanding, steps into that emotional gap every time, believing that love and patience can bridge it. What the avoidant doesn't expect is what happens when the empath stops chasing. When the empath finally reaches the point of emotional fatigue and decides to detach, the dynamic flips completely. The avoidant, who once felt powerful in their distance, begins to feel powerless in the silence. They can no longer predict or control the emotional flow. The empath's absence creates a void that the avoidant isn't prepared to face. The very stillness they once craved now feels suffocating. The avoidant is often drawn to empaths precisely because they provide emotional stability and understanding without demanding too much in return. But when the empath stops overfunctioning, the avoidant is forced to confront what they've been avoiding all along, their own discomfort with intimacy and dependence. Without the empath's constant reassurance, the avoidant can no longer escape the emotional mirror being held up to them. Their avoidance no longer feels like strength, it feels like emptiness. The empath's detachment removes the avoidant's safety net. There are no more gentle check-ins, no more emotional decoding, no more soothing words to soften their withdrawal. The avoidant begins to realize that their control was always an illusion, sustained by the empath's willingness to keep trying. When that energy disappears, the avoidant's emotional armor starts to crack. They experience a form of loss that feels confusing, not just the loss of the person, but the loss of the dynamic that kept them feeling secure in their avoidance. This is why the avoidant struggles so much when faced with the super empath's detachment. The empath's stillness exposes the truth that emotional distance doesn't protect them from pain. It only postpones it. The avoidant is left to sit in the discomfort they've been running from, realizing that control without connection isn't safety, it's loneliness. And for perhaps the first time, they see that the power they thought they had came not from their distance, but from the empath's persistence. When that pursuit ends, so does the illusion of control. When the super empath finally withdraws their energy, something powerful happens. The dynamic between them and the avoidant shifts completely. The empath's detachment becomes a mirror, reflecting back everything the avoidant has been projecting. For so long, the empath absorbed the emotional tension in the relationship. They took on the discomfort, the silence, the inconsistency, and turned it into understanding. They tried to interpret what wasn't being said, fill in emotional blanks, and keep the connection alive even when it was once one-sided. But when that effort stops, when the empath steps back and refuses to carry the emotional weight alone, the avoidant is suddenly confronted with the very emptiness they've been creating. The avoidant has spent much of their emotional life running from vulnerability. They're skilled at creating space when things get too intense. Distance feels like safety. Control feels like calm, but that distance also means they rarely have to experience what it's like to be on the receiving end of emotional neglect. When the empath detaches, the roles quietly reverse. The avoidant begins to feel what the empath has been feeling all along: uncertainty, disconnection, and longing mixed with confusion. They start to wonder why the warmth is gone, why the communication feels different, why the energy has shifted. What they don't realize at first is that they're feeling the echo of their own behavior. This is the power of the empath's detachment. It doesn't rely on confrontation or anger. It doesn't require words. It's an energetic silence that holds up a mirror to the avoidance emotional avoidance. The empath's absence becomes a form of truth-telling. It reveals what has always been missing: reciprocity, emotional responsibility, and presence. The avoidant, who once felt strong in their independence, begins to sense the discomfort of emotional isolation. They start to understand that distance doesn't eliminate vulnerability. It just delays it. What makes this mirror effect so potent is that it's not rooted in revenge or manipulation. The empath isn't trying to teach the avoidant a lesson, they're simply reclaiming their peace. They've realized that staying emotionally invested in someone who resists connection is self-betrayal. The withdrawal comes from a place of clarity, not coldness. But for the avoidant, that clarity feels like coldness because they've never experienced emotional boundaries that firm and that calm before. It destabilizes their usual rhythm of push and pull. In the silence, the avoidant begins to hear their own echoes. The unanswered messages, the hesitation, the withholding, it all comes back to them. The very behaviors that once made them feel in control now make them feel unseen. The mirror doesn't lie. It shows them how their avoidance affects others. It shows them the cost of emotional safety built on distance. And as they sit with that reflection, they may feel an unfamiliar mix of regret and awareness. The empath's detachment reveals what their empathy once hid, that love can't exist without presence, and that avoidance, when mirrored back, feels exactly like abandonment. Silence has a way of speaking truths that words often dilute. When the super empath finally goes quiet, it's not a game, it's not punishment, and it's not about creating drama. It's a moment of profound clarity. After giving, explaining, and empathizing to exhaustion, the empath reaches a point where their energy simply stops flowing towards someone who doesn't meet them halfway. The silence that follows isn't cold, it's clean. It's the sound of boundaries being formed, of emotional energy being redirected inward. To the avoidant, though, that silence can feel like rejection because it removes the emotional safety net they didn't realize they were relying on. The empath's absence, after so much presence, feels deafening. For a long time, the empath filled the quiet spaces with reassurance. They interpreted mixed signals, soothed fears, and bridged emotional gaps. They took silence from the avoidant and turned it into patience, thinking that love required understanding someone's wounds, no matter how much it hurt to do so. But eventually, the empath learns that every time they speak into silence, they are teaching the avoidant that withdrawal has no consequence. They realize that constantly chasing clarity only drains their own peace. So they stop. They allow silence to exist, not as punishment, but as truth. That truth is powerful because silence doesn't beg for attention, it demands self-reflection. When the avoidant no longer receives emotional cues from the empath, they're left alone with the stillness they once sought. For someone who has always equated distance with safety, that quiet starts to feel unsettling. The space that once felt protective now feels isolating. It's in that silence that the avoidant begins to feel the weight of their own emotional unavailability. The absence of the empath's warmth highlights just how much comfort and stability their presence once provided. The empath's silence becomes a language of boundaries. A language that says, I will not keep explaining myself to someone who isn't listening. It's a withdrawal of emotional labor that had been taken for granted. The empath finally recognizes that not every pause needs to be filled, not every cold moment needs to be warmed. In this realization, they step into self-respect. Their quiet no longer comes from hurt, but from wisdom. They understand that peace sometimes requires distance, and that not every connection deserves endless access. For the avoidant, that silence exposes the emptiness of their own detachment. They begin to feel what they've always feared, the loss that comes from pushing love away. What once felt like control now feels like loss of connection. The empath's quiet becomes the mirror of everything the avoidant refused to confront. Their fear of intimacy, their discomfort with vulnerability, their inability to receive love fully. And yet, the empath's silence is not cruel. It's compassionate in its honesty. It says, this is what it feels like when love stops chasing. It teaches that sometimes the most powerful message isn't spoken. It's felt in the spaces where words used to be. There comes a moment when the super empath realizes that chasing connection has nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. For so long, they've mistaken effort for affection, persistence for purpose, and self-sacrifice for intimacy. They believed that if they just understood better, listened harder, or stayed longer, the avoidant would finally meet them halfway. But healing begins when the empath stops chasing and starts choosing peace over confusion, self-respect over reassurance, and balance over chaos. The shift isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet, internal, and deeply powerful. It happens when the empath finally understands that love is not proven through endurance, but through reciprocity. When the empath lets go of the chase, they're not giving up on love, they're redefining it. They stop viewing love as something to earn and start seeing it as something to share. They no longer pour into relationships that drain them because they've learned that healthy love doesn't require constant emotional negotiation. This shift can be disorienting for the avoidant, who has become accustomed to being pursued. The empath's absence creates an unfamiliar void. There's no longer someone anticipating their needs or softening their distance. The relationship's balance changes not through conflict, but through quiet transformation. The avoidant often depended on the empath's emotional labor to maintain connection without having to fully engage. When that energy is withdrawn, they're left to face the stillness they've been avoiding. The dynamic that once gave them a sense of control starts to unravel. They begin to realize that the empath's consistency wasn't a given, it was a choice. And that choice is no longer being made. For the first time, the avoidant feels the weight of their own emotional absence. The empath's peace exposes the instability in the avoidant's detachment. For the empath, this detachment marks a turning point in emotional growth. It's where self-worth replaces self-sacrifice. They start to recognize that connection without mutual effort isn't love, it's dependency. They understand that being the emotional caretaker doesn't make them stronger, it keeps them stuck. The more they release the need to fix others, the more they return to themselves. Their love becomes rooted in discernment rather than desperation. They learn to hold space without losing themselves in it. This is what makes the shift so powerful. It's not a rejection of the avoidant, it's a reunion with the self. The empath no longer looks to another person for completion or closure. They no longer chase validation because they've realized that peace is the highest form of emotional fulfillment. The avoidant might interpret this as coldness, but it's actually maturity. The empath hasn't lost their heart, they've simply stopped offering it where it isn't met. And in doing so, they finally experience what real connection feels like. One built not on pursuit, but on balance, mutuality, and respect. The chase ends, but love doesn't. It simply evolves into something honest, grounded, and whole. When we look at the dynamic between the avoidant and the super empath, it's not really a story of one being strong and the other weak. It's a story of two people responding to pain in opposite ways. One by running from emotion, the other by running toward it. The avoidant hides behind distance to feel safe, while the empath hides behind understanding to feel needed. But eventually, both have to face the truth that love cannot thrive where fear leads. The super empath's detachment isn't revenge, it's awakening. It's the moment they stop confusing intensity with intimacy and realize that peace is the real measure of love. It's where they learn that their sensitivity isn't a flaw, it's their strength. But it's only powerful when it's protected. When they stop chasing, they rediscover themselves. Their silence, their calm, their stillness all become reminders that real connection doesn't have to be forced. It flows when both people are ready to show up. For the avoidant, that silence can be transformative too. It offers them a rare opportunity to look inward instead of away, to see that closeness isn't a threat but a gift. When they finally face what they've been avoiding, their own vulnerability, they open the door to deeper, more authentic connection. The lesson is not about blame, it's about awareness. When we understand the dance between avoidance and empathy, we learn how to stop performing and start relating. So if you've ever been the empath who gave until you were empty, or the avoidant who pushed love away out of fear, let this be your reminder: healing starts when you stop reacting and start reflecting. Love doesn't have to hurt to be real. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for the other person, is to step back, breathe, and choose peace over pursuit. Because real love doesn't demand you lose yourself to keep it. Thank you for listening, for reflecting, and for being open to understanding this delicate balance between emotion and space, connection and independence. Wherever you are in your journey, whether you're learning to let go, to open up, or to stay still, may you find the kind of love that feels safe, mutual, and calm. And remember this: the strongest heart isn't the one that never breaks, but the one that learns to love again, with boundaries, with wisdom, and with grace. Thank you for your time, your presence, and your willingness to feel deeply. Take care of your energy, honor your peace, and never forget, detachment isn't the end of love, it's the beginning of self-respect. Thank you, and take good care.